Welcome everybody to our Wicked Smart webinar series. I'm General Manager Teresa Tim of Midwest Family Dash. We've got some great info in store for you today. One of the things I'd like you to do as you're listening to our speakers this afternoon, if you've got questions for them, please use the chat box because I will be monitoring that. And we will save some time at the end of this webinar to answer those questions, as many as we can. But without further ado, I'd like to really dive into this and have Andy, our moderator, please introduce himself, and you can start the program, Andy. It's all yours.
Fantastic. Well, welcome to Wicked Smart webinar. This is our weekly, mostly weekly webinar where we're bringing in local experts that are business owners just like you to help business owners just like you and talk about topics that are relevant right now with everything we're going on, but also kind of hopefully getting you back to the new normal of running business and tackling things you're probably dealing with. So we kind of came along this topic here as I was discussing, had a conversation with Nikki, one of our speakers, on some really creative ways and some things to be considered when from a leadership perspective, but also if you have to, do layoffs or furloughs or those sort of things. But so I'm excited to be able to talk about this today. And Nikki Ryberg, she's going to be our first speaker today. She's the CEO and career coach at the Ryberg Group. She has a lot of expertise and some creative ideas from her experience. I was introduced to her because from our first topic of people that are making some interesting pivots with all the changes that happened in March. So, and then through our conversation, I learned about her expertise and it inspired this idea and this topic. And then our second speaker, Jessica Kramer, she's a person I have known for a couple of years now. And she's going to talk about bringing her expertise on some of the legal stuff to keep in mind, because you don't want to get caught in the penalty box if you do something wrong while you're maybe making actions too fast or maybe not fast enough. So I'm excited to be able to bring these topics to you. Now we'll start with Nikki. So if Nikki, if you want to jump on here, she'll be talking about layoff strategies that kind of help your businesses keep up morale, but also help you sleep at night as a business owner. So, Nikki, why don't you unmute yourself, and I'll hand it off to you if you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. This is actually my first one. I have kids at home, so I haven't actually participated in any of these Zoom meetings. So it's a little nerve-wracking to be speaking on my first one, and I'm hoping my kids stay in their rooms. So today I want to talk about some layoff strategies, and I just kind of wanted to let you know a little bit about my background. Before becoming a career coach, I actually worked in HR in a leadership role. So I've experienced terminations and reduction in forces as somebody who's delivered the message. I've had to make the decisions on it. So I know how hard it is, and I know it's never a decision you come by lightly. Now that I'm working as a career coach, I see a whole different side of things in terms of how it impacts the people that you make these decisions regarding their positions. And so it's a really tough spot for everyone to be in. And these are really unprecedented times. So anything I've experienced in the past is obviously, this is new territory for all of us. So I think the fact that there's so many uncertainties makes this even tougher than usual. So I think there's some things you can do I don't know if I have all the solutions, but there's at least some things to consider and things to think about before you do it. If you are in the unfortunate situation of having to lay people off, it's really good to think through these things ahead of time. And it's also very, very helpful that Jessica's on this call, because I have a lot of check with legal first, because you just do not want to get into a situation where that's an issue, especially when you're shorter staffed. So I think one of the first things to think about is, what, if anything, have you communicated previously? When a lot of this initially hit, people were saying, we'll be fine, we'll ride it out. Well, now suddenly we don't know how long this will last. We don't know when schools will be back in session. So you just really want to focus on how you can build trust and respect and having some consistent messages, even if it's unknown. Sometimes it's better to say nothing than to give too much incorrect information. So you really will want to gather your leadership team or kind of the key decision makers and just think about what have you said in the past. And then if you do have staff that will be departing, you really want to think about who it is, why it's happening, and are there any employment law claims to consider? Are there people recently coming back from maternity leave, ADA claims? I mean, just anything in terms of that. You just want to consider those things before you go ahead and do it and then call the attorney later. That's just a really bad practice to have. And then it's really, really tough for the staff remaining. I mean, they're wondering if they're next. They're wondering how much work they're going to have to do. Well, maybe they have kids or aging parents or other challenges that they have. So how do you start to communicate with them and keep their morale up so that business can continue as much as possible? That's really going to be important. Sometimes in the past, I've had clients or employers, they offer free lunch parties or things like that. It's not necessarily the best time to be spending money on those sort of things. But on the flip side, if you do nothing and morale gets really bad, when the economy picks back up, you may have no staff left. So you just want to be really cognizant of how you're treating those folks. And then future communication messages are going to be so important, not just from a morale standpoint, but from employment law. And then rehiring efforts. It's very, very important to have their contact information up to date. Make sure you have their email, make sure you have their phone number. And it's a really good time to know if any of their personal information is tied to your company's information. For instance, if they're running your social media page, it may be tied to their personal Facebook page. They could be in charge of your company LinkedIn page. Well, guess what? It may have been their initial LinkedIn that was in charge of that. So you're going to want to think through some of those things, just because you don't want to be the person who's asking them to work after you let them go. But sometimes people can have very emotional reactions to unfortunate situations. So you just don't want to put yourself in a position where you're at risk either. So just really think through, if you have an accountant who's been answering all of these security questions using their personal information, it's a really good time to check in with your IT policies and have all of that good stuff taken care of ahead of time before it's an issue. So for actually going into the layoffs, if you're in the unfortunate situation of having to do this, having a written letter confirming what the package details are, such as the date and reason, if it's due to COVID, check with an attorney on all of this, of course, but it's really helpful to have that, because when they go to file for unemployment, or if they have to contact their bank to ask for an extension on rent or their mortgage or something like that, having that on your company letterhead will greatly speed up their process, and it will also save you some work on the back end, because otherwise a lot of those agencies or institutions are just going to reach out wanting you to provide that information anyhow, and in some cases they'll ask you to verify it. If you're offering any severance, you'll want to make sure you have those sort of details in writing. Unemployment factors that in, so it's really important for them to be very clear on what those details look like. If you are providing any benefit or COBRA coverage, that's something really good to have in writing, and ideally you can work with your broker or your health insurance provider ahead of time to make sure you're clear on how invoicing and payments go, because sometimes that can be a clunky process. So you just want to make sure you're making it as helpful as possible for the people impacted. And then if you're in a situation where you're hoping to rehire, I know that there's a lot of great companies out there providing some templates on this. I would check into rehire steps. There's been some I've seen floating around on LinkedIn, but just what does that look like? Are they supposed to check in with you on a certain, every so many days? Do they need to check their email? Like, you want to make sure if you're intending to hire them back that they know what that process looks like. And then if you're not, then that's okay too. It's okay to just say, reach back to me when things kind of pick up. But all of the logistics like that, you really want to think through that first. And then it's the awkward situation of how do you handle their personal belongings. For the staff remaining there, are you going to have everyone there? Will you deliver the message, have them pick up their items? Will you be asking the current staff staying there to clean up their items? I can tell you from past experience, that's not a great thing for morale. For the people who are left, it's really uncomfortable if they're the ones boxing up items, especially these are their coworkers, their friends, sometimes their family members. So you'll just want to think through how those logistics work best for your company and your situation, especially since so many people right now have been working from home. They may not have been at their office in a while, and so that too can be some really tough situations to work through. How do you take care of all of those items? So just think about that in advance, because the more answers you have on those items and that you provide that to the parties, it really does make it smoother for everyone involved. And then how are you handling your employer belongings? If they have laptops and cell phones and all of this stuff let's say they have it at home right now, how do you want them to get it back to you? What type of expenses are you willing to incur on this? What sort of obligations do you have that they return it to you? How does that work with the stay-at-home order in place? Those are all really good legal questions. So you just want to make sure you're thinking of those things. And the more you can think through in advance and know how you want it to go, you'll really kind of help yourself in the process. So in terms of after the layoffs, who owns what work and how are you keeping operations going? If you're shifting duties around, if you can have more of that in writing and making that really clear and upfront to the employees left, that's very helpful. If you're asking them to do a lot more duties, are you paying them more? Are they just happy to have a job? I mean, how do you deliver those types of messages to really get people to come together as a team and pitch in without it completely impacting morale in a negative way? And so those can be some really careful areas to navigate. And so having a strategic plan in place on that and trying to really follow that and tweak it as you go will really be helpful. And then the other thing is there's going to be a ton of questions after the fact. And so who is the point person on inquiries or needs that come up from employees? Previously, I mentioned unemployment. There is so much paperwork with unemployment. I know they've tried to make that as easy as possible right now, but somebody needs to fill forms out. People need to verify that yes, indeed, they lost their job. If banks or landlords are trying to contact you, it's really important that you keep those things moving quickly. If you have a situation where employees are qualifying for any type of public programs, a lot of times those involve paperwork. So having someone in charge of that who has access to your payroll system, who you can trust to have access to that is really important to think through in advance. And that will help morale if people feel that they're being treated with respect and dignity who have been forced out. They will respect that, as will the people who are still there. So it's really a two-way street. And then employer needs, how are you going to handle hiring again? Did you get rid of people that maybe potentially you don't want back? Well, when things pick back up, if they're not the first person you're thinking of, how are you going to handle that? Was their layoff really due to COVID-19? Was it for other reasons? I think those would be really good questions that maybe Jessica can touch on a little bit from an employment law standpoint, because if some of this is trimming people who maybe aren't as productive as you need, when you start putting job postings out again and they apply and you don't rehire them, that's just something to think through before you hit that situation. So with that, I think there's some really nice things you can do from an outplacement standpoint if you would like to help these employees as much as possible. You can tell a little of my former HR days were coming out in terms of protecting you as an employer, but from the coaching standpoint, there is so much you can do to make the situation be as positive as it possibly can be. So in-house, a really helpful thing you can do is to write them a letter of recommendation. And ideally, if you could give this to them when you even give the news or within 48 hours, somehow to have it ideally you would give this to them as quick as possible. But it can't be the generic, oh, Susie worked here for 10 years, she was great, contact me if you have questions. It needs to have specific achievements and accomplishments, like she was an awesome rock star at answering phones. You know, she had 100% attendance. She went above and beyond. Everyone always commented on her great customer service. If it's a salesperson who typically did some really outstanding work for you, talk about some of the revenue that they helped drive for your organization. Really think about what have they done for you in the past year to two that you really think made a difference to your business or just the fit for your team. If you can put that on the letter of recommendation, that's going to stand out right now. As they go to apply for future jobs, that's something that really stands out in the stack of applicants because there will be more applicants than ever before. It's also very helpful to give them copies of their job descriptions. They can use that to write their resume, copies of their performance reviews, especially if they're positive, because they can use some of that information in their resume. And then maybe a top 10 list of, you know, the biggest strengths you think that they have. And then how do references work? Who should people contact if they need to conduct a reference? Depending on how many people are being eliminated, it could be that your HR person's no longer there, or maybe you're everything and you're not going to be able to be everything. So they really need to know who they should list as a reference and how to reach out to them. And then if managers are also being let go, do they have their personal information? Making that process as easy as possible and just kind of coordinating those logistics is really helpful. If they ever took any type of surveys with you, personality surveys, leadership surveys, giving them access to those results can also help them in their job search. If they had a resume on file, giving that to them, you'd be surprised by how many people have not done a resume in 10 years because they've worked at the same organization. And so they didn't keep that. They have a new computer. It's just not even something they thought about. So anything like that from a resume writer's perspective is very helpful for them to have. So even if this stuff doesn't seem important to you guys or to the employee, it will once they go through the resume writing process, because the expectations for resumes and LinkedIn profiles is really a lot different than it used to be even a few years ago. And then, is it something that they can outsource? You could consider helping them with this process if it fits in your budget. We'll get into that a little on the next slide. And then also, is there anything you can do to help with unemployment? The letter confirming their date and that they're no longer working there helps that. But if there's any information that you're able to find on the Department of Workforce Development's website to help that go as quickly and smoothly as possible, that's also very helpful. Unfortunately, a lot of your employees may have been using your business as their primary method of printing. So you would be surprised by how many people don't have access to a printer at home. If they're people who've been working 50, 60 hours a week, and that's just, you know, so many things have gone paperless, but now suddenly they're out of job and this sort of thing is going on. Those are just anything you can do to make it smoother and easier for them really will help them. And it's just things to keep in mind. And then also who's coordinating benefits or COBRA or anything like that. You'll just want to make sure you're working through that piece as well. And so some really creative outplacement ideas. I'm a resume writer. It's one of the services I offer through my business. There are some amazing resume writers out there that can assist with the resume, the cover letter, and the LinkedIn profile. And they really don't cost as much as you may think, especially if you find someone like myself, or there's ones all over the country who work independently. They can work with displaced employees and help them get their materials as sharp as possible. And that process doesn't just make their materials look good, it helps boost their confidence, it helps them stand out. It also helps them in the interview process because they need to know that type of information to interview well. And most of all, again, it helps with their confidence. It's really, really a tough spot to be in when you're the one on your way out the door and it's record unemployment and they just feel like they have a lot of hurdles against them. So if it's something at all in your budget, you may want to consider it. Also, a career coach can be very helpful. That's something that I also offer. Some people just focus on writing resumes. There's career coaches out there that only focus on, you know, what do you want to do for a living? What do you like? What are your strengths? Those can be really, really helpful for employees that need to, maybe their industries completely could be gone for a while. If you're looking at a situation where your business is completely shutting down because the market has changed drastically or you don't know when it will rebound, having those employees work with a career coach to help figure out how do we use those skill sets and help you pivot into something that is in demand to get you paychecks right away can be very helpful. And they can also help with mock interviews. It's easier to interview for a job that is the exact same thing you were doing before, but if you're in the situation where you're interviewing for something new, when you are pivoting, having that practice is really helpful, and displaced employees may not have the budget for that. So whether it's something you can help them with, or maybe just give them a list of resources they can reach out to on their own, that's helpful. So that ties into the next point. There's private coaches like me available. I'm more than happy to talk to any of you if this is something that applies to your situation or anyone you know of. But there's some great local organizations or nonprofits that help with this. You can check with your local community. I know right in Dane County, United Way have access to all sorts of nonprofits that offer this. And also, for example, UW-Madison, to anyone in Dane County, offers this service free of charge. And so if you just Google the UW-Madison Job Support Group, it will appear. They are currently doing all of their meetings. I believe it's every Wednesday, and they're offering it via Zoom. They also offer career counseling sessions, all sorts of good stuff. So even if it's not in your budget to offer any of this through a private vendor, there is access to this sort of information out there and to get some help. So even just maybe printing some flyers out on that and pointing them in the right direction, at least it's something to help. And then if you're in a situation that you want to offer this to a lot of people, there are some great firms out there nationwide and within the state that do this. I'm happy to give some referrals offline. Those can be very, very helpful as you have to go through that unfortunate process. So with that, I just wanted to see if anyone in the group had questions. We probably would maybe have time for, I don't know, 3 to 5, if that's okay with Andy, and then that was kind of where I ended it. But based on that, or what you guys are going through, can I help with any questions on that?
And I think, Nikki, what we'll do is we'll have people just note their questions, and we'll just handle them at the end just to make sure, because I'm sure there might be some that Jessica can kind of help answer prior to them asking it.
Okay.
And then just so we make sure we have enough time for Jessica to cover her stuff.
Perfect. Thanks.
Be able to. I did take your questions and I put them on the end as a prompt too.
Okay.
People. All right. Cool. Well, thanks, Nikki. I appreciate that information. I know it was helpful for me to understand some of the proactive things business owners can do to help transition because the people that are working for them are like their family members. So how can you do it with an open mind and an open heart, but also with a business mind too? So I think that was really helpful. So kind of moving along, I'm excited to introduce you all to Jessica. She's a very dynamic attorney here in Dane County. I've known her for a couple of years, very thorough and very knowledgeable. And she'll be talking about how to, some tips and things about replacing layoff employees or creating new positions, what you kind of can and can't do to kind of just keeping yourself off the naughty list as a business owner, hopefully. So Jessica, I'll pass it off to you. You're still muted.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. Nikki and I didn't even connect before this, but what we have to say is very much in sync. A lot of really good points from kind of the HR space that I'll kind of echo and then maybe go one step further onto the legal stuff. So first, there are terms that are kind of used interchangeably, and I think it's worth noting the distinction. So a layoff is when employment has ended, but there's the possibility of it being subject to resuming, is the way I look at it. It doesn't mean you promise that you would bring them, you're promising that you would bring them back. It just means that basically the reason for letting the employee go has nothing to do with the employee, but has to do with the availability or lack thereof of work or funds to keep them employed, essentially. A furlough is when they're actually staying employed, but you're just not paying them because they're not working or they're working less. Furlough is most commonly used in often larger organizations where employees are reduced to, 30% time or something that's often considered a furlough. And employees on furlough continue to receive benefits. They're still employees. They're continuing to, they hold their seniority. So furlough and layoff are sometimes used interchangeably, even though they really mean different things. And then termination is, you know, that this is the Jessica Kramer definition. Employment and everything that goes with it has ended forever. You're not going to bring them back. Again, it doesn't mean that you're refusing to ever bring them back, but there's certainly not a chance or hope of it as you see it. So before talking about what you can do in bringing people back or replacing them, I think it's important to think about the considerations in making the decision in the first place. And again, this touches on some of the things that Nikki already spoke about. But you want to use, when it comes to furloughing, I'm just going to touch on this because this isn't the focus of this discussion, but when it comes to exempt employees, so exempt means they're exempt from the overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standard Act. Usually salaried employees are exempt and hourly employees are non-exempt. You want to use caution. If you're going to take an exempt employee and reduce them, you have to think about how that's going to work, because you can't just tell them to not work one day a week and cut their pay. It's not that easy with exempt employees. So you definitely want to check with HR or an employment law attorney before furloughing exempt employees. One thing to consider if you think you need to lay some employees off due to lack of work or lack of funds to pay them is partial furloughs and a Workshare plan with that. And there's always been a Workshare option, but it's getting a little bit more press right now through the Wisconsin Department of Workforce Development, who enforces and administers unemployment insurance benefits program here in the state. Because under the CARES Act, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, which is federal legislation, it provides an opportunity for employers to use what's called Workshare, which is really just reducing multiple employees but keeping them employed rather than letting any employees go. So you have 10 employees and you have to reduce the compensation that you're paying them by 50%. Instead of letting 5 of them go, you would reduce all of them to 50% is how the Workshare works. And what's great about it is those people then are eligible for unemployment benefits to kind of make up the difference. Whereas normally, if it's not a Workshare plan, if you just have one employee and you're reducing them, they may or may not be eligible for unemployment benefits based upon that reduction, depending on what their compensation ends up at. So I've included a link here because there's a really nice explanation of the Workshare opportunity at DWD's website and what you as an employer have to get in place in order to take advantage of that. Another thing to think about, I'm kind of incorporating as many COVID-19 related things as I can here. Another thing to think about is if you have a Paycheck Protection Program loan, and you don't continue to pay full payroll, some of your loan may not be forgiven. So that's a consideration to make before making any layoffs or terminations or furloughs, because it may impact your loan forgiveness. You'll definitely want to talk with your accountant or tax professional about that. So when you're letting someone go, I'm just going to use that term to include layoff and termination. Think about the reasons for doing it and be mindful of any potential claims of discrimination. Also, sometimes just called wrongful termination. As most of you probably know, employment is at will unless there's a contract altering the at will relationship, which means that you can let someone go for no reason or any reason, as long as it's not a discriminatory reason, basically. So as Nikki alluded to, if you are laying someone off or letting someone go during an economic downturn, and the reason you're doing it is really because they're not a very good employee and you're kind of jumping on this opportunity to use this as an excuse, you really need to think that through and think, what reasons are you going to give them and what reasons are you going to document, because you're going to have to stand by those reasons if they sue you, okay? Or if it somehow comes back to bite you later. you're going to have to stand by those reasons. So don't just tell them it's a layoff due to budget, and then later they come back with some sort of claim, and you decide to list out all the ways that they were an awful employee. That's not going to look very good. And it might make them say, maybe there's some underlying motive going on here. And of course, if you don't have a discriminatory reason and there's no evidence pointing to it, at the end of the day, you'd probably prevail in such a claim, but you don't want to even invite such a claim to begin with or have to deal with it. Just like as always is important with any employment-related decisions, you want to document your actions and your reasons. So, putting in writing even just a very basic letter about the date of termination and the reason for it can go in the employee file. You can give them a copy so they have it for unemployment or whatever other purposes. So speaking of unemployment, who's eligible for unemployment? Well, right now, just about everybody. Pretty much if a person becomes unemployed partially or fully by no fault of their own, then they're going to be eligible for unemployment for one or the other of the several types of unemployment benefits available now. The Wisconsin standard for an employee being ineligible for unemployment is if the reason for the termination was substantial misconduct connected with employment. And I won't get into what that is, but so if someone really messed up, they stole from you, they did something really awful, and that's the reason you're letting them go, you should properly tell them that's the reason and report that to unemployment, because then they won't be eligible. But the vast majority of people are going to be eligible right now, including for the expanded benefits under the CARES Act, which is an additional $600 a week, which actually makes unemployment benefits more of a living wage for most people than the normal max of $370. So
Hey, Jessica,
$600 $370.
is there, we have business owners, in Indiana and Illinois and Missouri and Michigan. Is there a universal resource that you would recommend them checking? Because I know you're based in Wisconsin, but not everybody is here. So I just wanted to maybe you have a pointer that could point them in the right direction.
Yeah, do you mean for unemployment benefits or?
Yeah, so being able to find the resource for their applicable state when you're talking about, like, for example, unemployment or anything else. So.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of varies, but I would say that the U.S. Department of Labor is going to be the best centralized source. Right. And I think I have a link later to one of their pages, so I can touch on it a little more then.
Cool. Yeah, we have about 4 minutes left, so.
Okay, great. So, so let's see, where are we? Post-layoff considerations. So, okay, so you've let someone go. Whether you consider it a layoff or not is really kind of neither here nor there. But if you're considering bringing an employee back, you kind of have to go through a bunch of considerations, like, is it going to be the same position or not? Compensation, benefits, have all your ducks in a row. And again, if you're making any changes compared to their previous situation with you, be mindful of a claim of discrimination. Well, you're bringing me back, but it's at a lower position. Why? I want to know why you're doing this to me. If you're replacing an employee, that's going to bring you back to the reason given for the layoff. So that's why you have to think about it at the beginning. If you're telling them that you're laying them off because you're eliminating their position, but really you just don't want them on your staff anymore, and then 2 months later, you replace them and they learn about it, they're going to say, well, you lied to me. You didn't eliminate my position. And now you've replaced me with somebody that's younger than me. And I'm over 40, so I have an age discrimination claim. Easiest example. So that's why you want to be thinking about those things in advance. And you may not know whether you'll be filling that position again in the future. No one has a crystal ball, especially right now. But just be mindful of discrimination concerns. And then I think I have one more slide here. So another thing I wanted to touch on is another COVID-19 related law, and that's paid leave under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. So there's paid sick and family leave, and for the purposes of this topic, I want to mention the family leave. So those of you that have over 50 employees are already subject to the Family and Medical Leave Act. So you're probably aware of the requirements to hold a position open if someone goes on leave under FMLA. That now applies to employers of all sizes, first of all, one employee. And it applies if their leave is due to their children being home from school or daycare. So like Nikki's home with her kids right now, I'm home with my kids, with my kid. And, you know, if I weren't self-employed, I would be asking my employer to pay me leave because of the fact that I can't work full time because I'm home with my kid. If someone basically has to be completely on leave, like their job really isn't a remote work type job, or they have 6 kids, so there's no way they can do any work, then you pay them the leave under the FFCRA, which is budget neutral, by the way. You get reimbursed on your payroll tax, quarterly payroll taxes. But then if you have fewer than 25 employees, you don't have to hold a position open as long as you follow these 3 points on the slide here. The position is no longer available, okay? So they take 12 weeks of leave to care for their kids because there's no school or no daycare programs available for them. And by the time they're ready to come back, you know, you had to eliminate that position. And it had to be due to the pandemic. So due to a financial downturn or some other impact on your business because of COVID-19. You have to make reasonable efforts to restore the employee. Maybe there's another position you can put them in. And if you still can't do that, then you have to make reasonable efforts to contact them within 1 year if a position becomes available. So if you have fewer than 25 employees and one of them essentially doesn't work for you anymore because they had to take leave to be with their kids, you have to keep them on your radar for 12 months from the time that the leave ends, not begins, ends. And if there's a position available that you need to fill that matches with their skills, you need to contact them to rehire them, or you'll be in violation of the Family and Medical Leave Act. So I'll just leave you with the link to the Department of Labor. They have a really good FAQs on various topics. The one I linked here is to this leave provision under FFCRA. But they have links about the CARES Act and about unemployment, including links directing you to other states. Unemployment is always going to be administered by the state, but there's a lot of federal law that kind of underlays it. So that can be a good starting point, especially employers that have clients in multiple states or employees in multiple states.
Cool. Yeah, and we will provide the slides in the recording too, so you don't have to write this down. We'll be able to send these slides out afterwards. I think we have probably about 5 minutes for questions. If that, TK, has any come through so far that either Jessica or Nikki can kind of jump in and navigate and help?
Yeah, there was one that says employee hours were eliminated by nature of their role. They were not formally laid off, but their work will not be back soon, if ever. Now what? Do we send a formal letter of termination? Can that letter be retroactive?
I would say, yes, it can be retroactive, and really effectively it would be for the purposes of things like unemployment. As far as whether, to send a formal letter of termination, that really kind of depends on the employer's usual practice, because there's no requirement that you put a termination in writing ever, unless you have a contract requiring it, or in like a union situation or something. But that being said, if it originally was just sort of a temporary layoff or furlough, and now it seems like this is likely permanent, it's probably good to put in writing, here's the status as of this date, we'll contact you if anything changes. Just so that it's clear that they, so they don't claim that they were expecting to come back and waiting.
How about this question? Any tips for laying off people when we can't see them in person? Is laying off via Zoom tacky?
I think Nikki could take this one.
You got to unmute yourself, Nikki.
That's a really good question. Normally, I would say it's tacky, but right now it may be unavoidable. I think if you schedule it so they may know it's coming and that they can make sure that they're free to have the conversation with you, don't do it just randomly like 45 minutes in advance. Oh, hey, we need to do a quick Zoom chat. Like maybe you give them a day or like 2 days notice saying, hey, we need to have a meeting at this date and time. It needs to be via Zoom. I need you to make yourself available for the full time. I think if you have to do it that way, it's far better to do it in Zoom than it is to send an email or just give some generic phone call. I also think if you can give a lot of those items that I discussed earlier to help them and have all of that ready to go, it will make it better than it could have been. It wouldn't be the ideal way to do it, but I would be able to email them as we were like chatting live, like, here's, you know, this letter I wrote for you, you're great at these things, here's where you go for these questions, and you like A to Z lay it out for them. It's better than just sending some generic email or doing nothing at all. And I think making the effort to do it via Zoom is far better than just a phone call.
Thank you. How about this question? How do we handle those who want to stay laid off because they make more than where they currently work?
So I'm assuming that the because they make more is referencing unemployment, and this is a common question right now. So the kicker, though, to that for these employees is that if there's work available to them and they don't take it, they are no longer eligible for unemployment. So the responsible thing to do as the employer in that situation is to offer them that work and offer it in writing and get their confirmation that they're not taking it. And then you need to report that to the unemployment office. And really, if you don't, then you're potentially a party to fraud for not informing the unemployment office that this person refused available work.
Thank you. Here's another question. So you talked about the FMLA law regarding 1 year. What about the layoff individual that we post a job and we hire for the position, just not them? How long do we have to wait before they find out for it, then file a claim for whatever claim they want to claim as far as discrimination goes? You said a year for the Medical Leave Act. What about a layoff person?
There's no requirement in a layoff situation. However, the vast majority of wrongful termination claims carry a statute of limitations of 300 days. So it's a little, it's like 10 months is when you are, likely in the clear from such a claim.
Thank you. And that looks like all the questions that came through. We have about 3 minutes left before we wrap up. Andy, what do you have?
Just want to introduce the next webinar if we're not seeing any other questions come in here last minute. So
I do have one. Hang on.
Okay.
Do you have to participate in the Workshare program with DWD in order for employees to receive the additional $600 per week on partial unemployment?
I don't think you do. However, whether they would receive the full amount is a little less clear. So typically if someone is just reduced, like let's say before the $600 came into play, the normal max is $370. If someone were reduced, there's a formula that's applied that would say how much they can still get. So it might be that they can only get $100 of the $370. But if you participate in a Workshare program, they might be eligible for more. So if you're considering, and it has to be 2 or more employees, because that's the sharing part of it, right? So if you're considering reducing 2 or more employees, there is no harm other than the time it will take you to go ahead and set up a Workshare program that complies with the DWD's requirements.
Thank
you. And that's it. Andy, go ahead and introduce next week's.
Okay, well, you might recognize one of these speakers. So we are focusing on how to effectively track your marketing wins and losses with Google Analytics. So as a business owner, as a CEO, as a leader in your business, if you're not running the marketing, you probably have the questions or is my marketing working? And that's the primary question that we're going to help you answer is how is your marketing working? How well is it working? Is it attaching to your business's goals? How can you monetize it? How can you track it? How can you forecast it? And really how you can start figuring out it's a hypothesis, an educated guess, and being able to lead strategically from data, based information and not hunch or gut-based information. And I'll be speaking on part of that topic. And Kyle Carpenter, who is a fantastic digital expert here at Midwest Family, will also be talking about another part of it. And we'll kind of team up to cover that topic and have a very, something I've been really excited about. We were going to do this live a few weeks ago, but now we're forced to do a webinar. But it'll be a really helpful tool for any business owner that decides to register for it. And you should be able to register it with the in the email, the follow-up email. There should be a place where you can register for it right away. So I'm excited.
Yeah, so thank you, Andy. Thank you to our guest speakers today. And for those of you joining on this call, you will get a link, as Andy said, to the recording and the slides. And there will be an invite for next week's webinar if you want to just go ahead and sign up right then when you receive that information with your recording and your slides. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you next week.